This is The Comics Alternative, episode 299, reviews of recent comics about the Beatles. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Sterg, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And this week, Sterg and I are going to be looking at recent or relatively recent books that deal with the Beatles in one form or another. But before we get to that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of The Comics Alternative is brought to you by those wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be anywhere from 20 to 35% off the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some mind-blowing specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
That's right, Derek. And for instance, this month, if you go on right now, you will find Lennon, the New York Years hardcover for 35% off. That's one of the books we're going to be talking about. And another one, and the recent adaptation of the Beatles' Yellow Submarine, also in hardcover, also 30% off. So those are out there and beautiful looking books.
Yeah, we're going to be discussing those, and we highly recommend that you check both of those books out, as well as other great deals that you can find at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com. They will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
Yeah. See what I did there?
I see what you did. Very good. Well, Sturge, before we jump into the Beatles, one of my favorite topics of discussion, music and otherwise, I want to mention that I know you have discussed in the past your blog, Graphic Novel Resources. And I think, the URL is graphicnovelresources.blogspot.com?
That's it.
Yes. Last week when we were talking about what we were thankful for our Thanksgiving show, one of the things you brought up is the nib and the nib publication, the physical publication. Just recently you put up a review of the nib. Yeah. And I looked at that. I read that, and it's really informative, and I can tell that you're really excited about this publication. So
cool.
I encourage our listeners to go check out your blog if they haven't already.
Well, thank you for the plug there. I have it. I just set it up in advance. It publishes every 5 days, basically on multiples of 5. So, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. That's the multiples of 5 in case you didn't know at home.
Yeah. So, you can get a double shot of Sturge, by listening to this podcast and checking out his blog.
There you go. Also helps with sleeping. The blog, not the pod. The podcast it'll keep you awake.
We hope.
Yes, that's exactly true.
Pop! Pop go the Beatles!
Well, let's jump into our discussion of recent titles that deal with the Beatles in one form or another. And there are 4 books in particular that we're going to be looking at. We're going to start with Lennon, the New York Years. It is written by David Foenkinos and adapted by Corbeyran and Horne. And I'm probably mispronouncing some of those names there, so please excuse me if I am. After that, we're going to be looking at Bill Morrison's recent adaptation of Yellow Submarine from Titan. And by the way, the Lennon, the New York Years is by IDW.
Oh, yeah.
Then after that, we're going to look at a very recent book that came out, late this month. In fact, in bookstores, it may not even be out yet because the release date, according to Amazon, is November 30th. And that is The Beatles in Comics by Michel Mabel and Gaetz and a variety of artists. Mm-hmm. And then we're going to wrap up with a book that's not really about the Beatles, but uses the Beatles for the most part as a backdrop. And so I think it's worth discussing. And this is M. Dean's I Am Young. And this is coming out from Fantagraphics.
Mm-hmm. And the Beatles in Comics came out from NBM, or is coming out from NBM.
That's right. Yeah, NBM. Now, one recent book that deals with the Beatles that we're not going to be discussing is Carol Tyler's Fab Four Mania. Not because it's not a great book, it is. And it has everything to do about the Beatles, especially a young Carol Tyler's relationship with the Beatles. But we interviewed Carol earlier this year, and we spent a lot of time on that book. So we thought we'll just skip that one.
I got you. It's one I'm excited to read. I've seen a bunch of the preview pages, but I haven't flipped it yet. But I love her work. So
yeah, it's a great book. And also that was a fun interview.
Mm-hmm.
She's
she was
wild.
Fun to listen to.
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
And, I don't know if you listened to the interview, but she sang much of the time.
Oh yeah. I love that in a podcast.
Yeah. And it kind of caught me and Gene a little off guard, but we had a good time. It was wild fun. But graphic novels and comics about the Beatles, it's really nothing new. And, in the past few years, we've seen other such texts. Back in 2016, there was The Fifth Beatle, the Brian Epstein story. And actually, Gene and I interviewed Vivek Tiwari when the book came out. So that's a book about the Beatles, but from Brian Epstein's perspective. Mm-hmm. And then there was a book that I think we were talking off, Mike, you've read, but I haven't gotten around to it yet, even though I have a copy. And this is 2012's Babies in Black, Astrid Kirchherr, Stuart Sutcliffe, and the Beatles. What did you think of Babies in Black?
I loved that book. It was by Arne Belstroff, I said his last name wrong, Belstorff. And who's a German creator, and the book was originally published in German. And I just loved it. It's one of these black and white books. And what I loved about it was really the images, because they look so young. Mm-hmm. And they were like teenagers. So they're all like these little fresh faced fellows, and they're all, the way that they're drawn with the little like pencil etchings and almost like charcoal. It looks like charcoals, the whole thing, but like the real stylized hair, and they all have little rosy cheeks, well, as rosy as you can make them in black and white and gray.
Yeah.
But but the story was, I don't know. It was one of those books that I read and I was like, this person is clearly a early Beatles fan, and it's a labor of love. It was one of those just kind of beautiful objects. And, I really enjoyed reading that.
Yeah, and that was the second book, I believe.
It was a second book.
Yeah.
And it also kind of, we were talking a little off mic too, kind of something that struck me is that a lot of the books that we're talking about, or the creators, they seem to be European, which, I don't know, there's kind of a fascination with maybe the Beatles or early rock and roll in general that's coming from that quarter.
Right. Of the 4 texts that we're going to be discussing this week, 2 of them are translations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, speaking of which, let's go ahead and get started with the first book, Lennon, The New York Years. And This is based on, I guess, a prose text originally written by David Foenkinos. And in fact, I was looking this up, and I haven't gone to the French site. I'm looking at the American Amazon site, and I'm seeing that the Kindle edition of Foenkinos' Lennon came out in 2010, the paperback edition 2012, I believe. Okay. So this is a book that's been out for a while now. I have not read it. I don't even know if it's translated into English, the prose version. Mm-hmm. So I have no way of comparing it to this graphic novel. But whereas the prose version is titled just Lennon, for some reason, the graphic novel published by IDW, and by the way, we should mention that this originally came out in May of last year, 2017.
Gotcha.
is called Lennon, the New York Years, which in many ways makes sense given the book's structure, and we can talk about that. But this is something that originally appeared in French. It is translated by Ivanka Hannenberger, and Hannenberger has translated a number of texts that we've looked at on the Comics Alternative. I'm curious, what are your, and this is a book that is in black and white, or at least in gray tones. What are your thoughts of this book?
There were things about this book that I wanted to be annoyed at, and I couldn't get myself annoyed at them.
Well, like what? What did you want to be annoyed at?
The structure of it, how it's kind of set up as it's multiple chapters. It's 18 chapters, but each one is kind of
sessions.
Session, but they're chapter sessions, like this mythical, not mythical because it's not real. It's fictional is what the word I'm looking for. Basically psychologist sessions with John Lennon sitting and talking to a person with a pad, and how each one of these sessions or chapters is supposed to be kind of capturing what he's talking about in those moments. And there's a part of me that thinks that's some kind of like hack structure. And I'm not going to enjoy the book because it's like this really clunky setup. In my mind, it was a clunky setup. But I actually I forgot about it, is I think what happened. And because of that, I kind of got caught up into the narrative and how it was told. And I think a very kind of moving and just quick. And I had a lot of high emotional points, or high and low, really. I think it just had a flow that made me forget the structure and just kind of accept it. So I kind of like that.
It's interesting to hear you say that, because one of the big draws for me of this book is the thing that you were suspicious of at first, and that is the way that it's structured, right? Now when you were calling them chapters and I said, well, they're sessions. Now, the different sections or chapters are referred to as sessions. And so apparently these are the various sessions that Lennon has with his psychologist or psychiatrist, whoever this individual is. And we should mention that even though we do see that the person that he's talking to is a woman with a pad, we never see her face. And I think that that's significant. Because I felt fairly early on in the narrative, and I kind of like you, I was thrown a little at first. It's like, oh, I didn't know John Lennon saw a psychologist. Why would I know, right? But it seems interesting that you would have him talking with the psychologist. And so each of the sections or chapters, if you want to call them that, are different sessions that he has with his psychologist. Now, I do think it's significant that getting back to, describing the psychologist, we don't see her face, because I saw her as a stand-in or a proxy for the reader.
Okay.
Because Lennon, the book is made up of 18 chapters or sessions and then an epilogue. With the exception of the epilogue, everything is told in the first person. So it is John Lennon talking with his psychologist about, and we can talk about the topics, a variety of issues. Many of them don't even deal with the Beatles. It's his relationship with his mother, his father, which I think is a big draw in terms of this book. But instead of him talking to the psychologist, I got the sense after a while that he's talking to us, the reader. And that, so that's why I feel that the psychologist is a proxy for us, the reader. So the 18 sessions or chapters are all told in the first person, except for the epilogue. Now, the epilogue is told in kind of a detached third person point of view, but that concerns his assassination.
Right.
Yeah. Understandably so. I mean, you wouldn't have him talking in the first person there, unless it's some kind of Sunset Boulevard thing going on.
I think what surprised me too about the narrative is just how much of a history it was, kind of almost a chronological history of his life. Because of the title, I expected the New York year. I expected it to be a lot more centered on that and not so much centered on the kind of formative years in his childhood. So, I mean, it makes sense because those kinds of, that's the bookends really, like the beginning and end of the book are the kind of New York structure and him commenting on his life. So, I mean, it wasn't like I was disappointed, but it did a lot of things I didn't expect it to do, in terms of that. And I enjoyed it. I mean, I also mentioned that there was something about it I tried to not like, and that was the art. It's not the art itself. It's the fact that it recycles a lot of imagery. And like, it's one of those things I noticed, that there's certain images that are repeated. And when I say repeated, I don't mean redrawn. They seem to just be like photoshopped thing. Like the doctor always is in the same pose, holding the same pen and the same pad in the same area. Like the doctor's like an icon. And maybe that's what, in the end, it didn't bother me, because there's a part of me that's like, like a pure comics person, like, like, oh, you have to draw it all and sweat it all out. And, every panel, if there's 9 panels, they all have to be, you have to draw them all out by hand or something like that. And I don't know why I have that in my head. But in this book, there's a lot of images that are recycled, used and they're reused and they're recycled. Yeah.
And you're right. And again, it's interesting to hear you say that, because what you thought of as a potential limitation, I liked. I liked the fact that the artist Horne is taking certain images, verbatim, so to speak, right? So, there's not really any tweaking or changing or different perspectives, but using it sometimes within a different context. And I appreciate that.
Yeah. And I think it worked. It worked for me, kind of like I said, like in a way, it's kind of like iconography in the book, because things get, I mean, sometimes like there's an image and it gets, put into different perspectives slightly. Like it's there's more of like a look at specific details. Like, if it was a camera, it'd look like more like a close up or like a pan out kind of thing. There's parts where they do that, but it's also, I mean, I guess in a weird way, I don't know if this was intentional or not, but it's kind of like this, like predisposed pop culture, kind of like in a Warhol way, which I kind of like that in a way, because it's produced. I mean, the Beatles were kind of one of the, I mean, maybe they weren't the first, but definitely a mass produced object or item or something, an image. That's part of what makes them so huge, is that they were, they weren't, I don't know if they were the first boy band, but they were damn close, or the thing that we conceive of as kind of a boy band nowadays, although they turned into something entirely different and larger. I
don't know if I'd call them a boy band.
Well, they were boys.
They were boys.
Popular. And all the girls were screaming. I mean, like, to me, it's like.
Right, but they were doing something much more serious than boy bands.
They ended up doing something much more serious.
Oh, even their early stuff. Come on. I mean, playing a lot, even their covers.
Well, yeah, I get that. Well, maybe they were, I don't know. See, I think boy bands turned into something different. I think they were kind of the template for a boy band. They were cute. They had a rough edge to them. I don't think boy bands have the rough edge anymore, but I think that they had that. Yeah. I will agree. I will agree with that. It's just that their source material was a lot rougher, and now it's I don't know, it's so cleaned up. But I think that that kind of marketing package, I mean, and the book kind of resists it somewhat. I mean, because this isn't the the tell-all biography, like gets into the dirt, but it definitely doesn't just show John Lennon as all peaches and cream. Like, it definitely addresses some of the more violent episodes of his life, and the fact that he neglected his first son, and all the drugs and the kind of whoring around he did.
Yeah,
it doesn't show him as like a super, like, he's not an angel in this book.
Oh no, definitely. And I think that again, coming back to the therapeutic setting, that's one of the things that I think is the book's strength, because in that therapeutic setting, not only can he tell the story of not only the Beatles but his life. His life growing up, his life with his mother and aunt, his problems with his father, which we get a lot of.
Right.
But he also confesses to things that he's ashamed of, like you mentioned, the violence. Right. I don't know if he's so much ashamed of being with other women.
Right.
But the drugs is something that I think he's definitely ashamed of, and the violence. I mean, he definitely regrets that.
Right.
And you're right. He comes across as a character who's not that attractive at times. But I think that is made possible because of the therapeutic context that we have here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree. Like I enjoyed this book a lot more than I'm maybe letting on. I was kind of, like I said, I was very much surprised. I think it's got a certain amount of personability and charm, and I don't mean charm like in a kitschy sense. It's just that it makes John Lennon seem like a fully realized kind of person, and someone not maybe to relate to, but to kind of just empathize with and learn about, and his life being, one of the, I don't know, really picked upon lives in the last, in the 20th century, certainly, as as public a figure as he was. I mean, to me, and it's not like you said earlier that you're a Beatles. Oh, well, you didn't say you were a Beatles. Are you a Beatles fan? Would you call yourself a Beatles fan?
Big time.
Okay, so I am too. Like, and if you get into that whole like Stones Beatles thing, you pick Beatles.
Oh, I would definitely pick Beatles over that.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay, and I would too.
Yeah, although, and this is kind of jumping ahead, but I believe it's in Beatles and Comics. One of the things that the writers point out that, this whole thing about Beatles, Rolling Stone is kind of a fiction, right? I mean, there really wasn't that rivalry, but the real rivalry was between the Beatles and the Beach Boys. Right. Which makes perfect sense to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, they're in the same section of the record store.
Yeah. And the B's.
That's right. In the BEAs.
Yeah, that's right. We'll get to that eventually. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I love the Stones. But if I had to pick only one band of all musical acts to listen to, if like God said you can only listen to one musical act for the rest of your life, hands down, I would have no problem, no hesitancy saying Beatles, of course.
Right. Yeah, and I'm kind of the same way in a lot of ways. I mean, they're a band that, I'm going to say this. I don't know if she's going to listen, but my wife is not a Beatles fan, and
what's wrong with her?
Well, she's a widespread Panic fan, is what she is. Well, and even then, she only likes the joke with her friends is that she only likes 25% of their songs. So she's just tough all around on what on the musical artist she likes. But the kind of thing is, like, I'm a big REM fan too. And one of the things that always kind of dumbfounded me is that in Michael Stipe, he always talked about the Beatles like he was like, that's garbage. It's elevator music. I hate it. I don't listen to it. And I was like, how can you just dismiss that? One of the most influential artists of the last. Well, sure. And I was like, you got to kill your you got to kill your parents or your idol. I don't know if we're going to get all Freudian. Yeah, that's right. That was my other thing that I was really glad. I was dreading that the psychologist was going to end up being his mom at some point, and I was like, oh, I was so glad that didn't happen. Like, I hope that's not a spoiler, but it's a positive spoiler if it's a spoiler. I was waiting for that in like some kind of dreadful, like, I was thinking bad things just going into this book. I don't know why. Like, I was just anticipating not good things, but I was only rewarded with good things. So.
Yeah. And we've already mentioned that there's a lot in here about his relationship with his father, especially his mother. Right. And how he lived much of his time with his aunt. But I think it's his relationship with, his mother, Julia, that is so, one of the things that really stands out in this book. Another thing, you had mentioned that it's more or less set up chronologically, and you're right, because we do get toward the beginning him talking to the psychologist about, growing up and his problems with his parents. Then we get his first work with the Corbeyran.
Right.
And then we just go from there. And of course it ends with, references to Yoko. Not counting the epilogue, where he's assassinated, but, so, we do get a lot of Lennon's life in chronological order, and not just with the Beatles, because there's also quite a bit of what was going on with him in the 1970s. And there were times during the 70s that things were really screwed up. There was that lost weekend that he called, where he basically, was on a lot of drugs. He was seeing, Ming Pai?
Right. Was that the personal assistant?
Yes, to Yoko. With, to some degree, Yoko's blessing.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of really interesting psychological moments in this book.
Yeah. But like you, I was surprised that even though, yes, this is centered around the life of John Lennon, it's not just about John Lennon. Because we get a lot about the Beatles. We get some information about his relationship with Paul. And I mean, I don't know what Foenkinos, what kind of research he did for his original book. But apparently Paul had reached out to John a number of times during the 1970s just to touch base and to make sure everything's okay.
Yeah, and there were lots of moments like that lost weekend, and I don't know. For me, one of the things that stood out was in his childhood that it seemed like a week or a month or something like that when his father was really, really nice to him, but kind of as a overture to try to get back with his mother, and then they have a huge blowout right in front of him, and then they just kind of ask like, "Who do you want to live with?" Like right in the moment. Like I was like, "Geez," it's like how do you deal with that in your life? Like that's just like one of the most horrific things I've ever seen depicted in a graphic novel. It was just like, ugh.
Yeah, that's got to screw you up.
Like just emotional, devastation, like all around. Because I don't think I knew as much as I've kind of picked up over the years. There's a bunch of things I didn't pick up on, like or know about as much as I thought I did. Like in terms of those, I didn't quite get all the reasons why the Beatles stopped touring. I thought they just kind of stopped touring because they just wanted to experiment. And I did not realize all of that episode that they talked about with like the death threats and, them thinking about what was happening in terms of civil rights and leaders, getting picked off, and that, how that kind of contributed and how huge they were, just literally how huge they were, that they were, getting similar kind of threats and just, them being that visible and being, their message being, I don't know, maybe seen as positive or progressive or whatever it was, drawing that kind of attention that would get them, murdered basically.
Yeah.
Which ended up happening to him anyway, which is kind of ironic.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things, and the book points this out as well, not only the death threats, but I think their artistic integrity was being called into question, or at least they felt that they weren't being true to their art.
Right.
I mean, when you're playing these big stadiums, like Kaminsky Park, like Shea Stadium, like Candlestick Park, all the screaming, all the people who were there, they couldn't hear themselves and they couldn't hear their instruments. And so they're sure that they sounded like crap,
right?
But they weren't sure because they just couldn't hear themselves. And it got really wild. I don't know if you've seen clips of, the Beatles at Shea Stadium, but there's one scene where they're playing one of my favorite early songs. This is a Paul song, "I'm Down."
Right.
And John is at the keyboard and he's just going crazy. It's like all of a sudden he snapped and he's playing the keyboard with his elbow. And it just gets wild. And, the Beatles actually recount this. I don't know if you've seen the videos of, the anthology. But they recount, I haven't seen those. Yeah. And they recount, I don't know if it's Paul or John or George who says something about that. He says, and John just seemed like he was going crazy. But yeah, I mean,
it's a good Paul.
Thanks. But it wasn't doing anything to their music. They weren't developing. And so they just decided, for all of these reasons that we've mentioned, to pull back, quit touring, and to work in the studio. And whenever they were available to the public, it was through what we now call music videos.
Right.
Yeah. And in fact, they were the ones who, you could make the argument, who really invented the music video.
Yeah, I was thinking that too. I was thinking that with I'm not going to jump ahead, but I was thinking that kind of Yellow Submarine was, there's plot in Yellow Submarine, but I was also thinking, man, it's like a stitch of it's an album's worth of songs. cartoon form with some plot around it. So I was like, man, that was, I mean, like a huge extended music video, really.
Exactly. In fact, you could isolate in Yellow Submarine, the film, the animated film, those sections where they play music like Nowhere Man or Only a Northern Song. You could isolate those, and those could be music videos in and of themselves outside of the film.
Oh, yeah. Well, I did a little bit of research too, and what I learned is that none of the Beatles' voices in that movie are the Beatles' voices until the very end, and the songs
where you actually get the Beatles.
Right. So it kind of is like noticeable because it's like, oh, that's who they are. It's not the mumbly. It's one of the things listening to the clips. I went and listened to some of the cartoon, and it's like it's almost like those old Fleischer Superman cartoons where you can't understand what they're saying. It's just because they with the sound and matching up, so they kind of just make them all mumbly, so and hope nobody notices. Like that's how I kind of think about it.
Well, now that we're discussing Yellow Submarine, let's go ahead and transition, unless there's something else about Lennon, the New York Years you wanted to interject.
No, I think we hit all the points.
Yeah. Well, let's move over to Bill Morrison's Yellow Submarine. Okay. And this came out through Titan back in August. So it's been out for a few months. And it's something that I think at one point we had intended to have Bill Morrison on the show. We weren't able to arrange that according to our schedules. But we did want to discuss the Yellow Submarine, and we thought this Beatles episode would be the perfect opportunity, of course.
Oh yeah.
So Yellow Submarine. Now, you were telling me before we started recording that the last time you saw this in its entirety, you were a kid.
Oh yeah, I was like maybe 5.
Wow.
I remember seeing it. It was a long time ago.
Yeah, I can't remember the last time I saw the film in its entirety. One of the things I had intended to do before we recorded today was to rewatch the film, but I didn't have the time to do so, unfortunately, because I wanted to get a sense of, how Morrison adapted the film to graphic novel form. I got a sense of reading this book that it more or less followed faithfully the main plot of the animated film, and I think it does.
Yeah, and I will go so far. There's not much on YouTube from Yellow Submarine, but there's about 8 scenes that I could find, and the ones I saw, I mean, they're almost 1-to-1 correspondence in terms of like and not necessarily the imagery, but definitely the dialogue and the plot. Those scenes are very much the same. Even the puns, which that's one of the things I was like, this book is if you like puns, this is a book for you.
Yes, it is. And, you mentioned that in the animated film, we don't have they're not the actual Beatles voices. The only time we get the actual Beatles is at the very end of the film, when the animation fades out and then their images fade in. And of course, the 4 Beatles at the very end of Yellow Submarine, the film, are in a black background. And of course, they're joking around and they're quibbing and they're punning. And then it ends with John Lennon looking through a telescope and he sees something. He says, "Oh, we're surrounded by blue meanies." He says, "There's only one way to escape, one way to go out, and that is singing." And then they end the film by singing all together now, appropriately enough, which is great.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I love that. That's one of my favorite endings of an animated film. And it's not even the animated part that's so significant. But you're right. So it's not the Beatles' voices, but the writers of the original Yellow Submarine. And of course, you get this in Bill Morrison's adaptation of the film. They capture the tone of the Beatles.
Yeah, they sure do. I agree. And it's not, this is one of those books that I wanted to think. There was a question I had, and that was like, who is this book for?
That's a great question.
Because it's an adaptation of a movie that you can see the movie. Are you a fan of the movie? Do you want it visually? Because it's very faithful too. It's not like this is some kind of riff or some kind of like modern
Yellow Submarine the next day.
Yeah. That's right. It's not like, the hunt for Red October, the hunt for Yellow October or something like that. It's a different kind of thing, but it's not. It's beautiful. I loved looking through it. I love that it's vibrant. The colors. It's a gorgeous book. There's a part of me that wants to not like the plot because it's very, set up kind of like this light dark dichotomy, like, oh, the blue meanies are coming. But I think we're kind of in a time where the blue meanies are back. And
yeah, although we would call them the orange meanies.
Yeah. The colors changed, right? Although I'm just flipping the book right now. The first and last page, the end papers are like really orange. I don't know if that's meaningful or not, but maybe maybe that's supposed to be yellow. I don't know. It looks orangish to me. But I did have that question because this is it's not a cheap book. It's a nice book. It's a large, expensive, but it's well produced. So, I'm like, this is not for a casual person. This is for a Beatles fan, I guess. It's for us.
Yeah. Because I can't. Okay, I was about to say I can't imagine, let's say, a younger reader who has almost no experience with the Beatles, much less the film Yellow Submarine, picking this up and, intentionally and, really, taking it in. I guess that's possible. I don't see that, though, as viable an option as what you'd mentioned, Beatles fans.
Yeah. And maybe that's a huge thing. It must be a huge thing to some degree. I don't know if it's like, I think of like, Kiss fans. Like, I don't know if it's a product, Kiss makes it and puts their face on it or their logo on it and people buy the heck out of it from what I can tell. So maybe it's like that with Beatles member, but I don't know. Maybe there's not a lot of it though. It seemed to me like there was a damper on a lot of Beatles theme things for such a long time.
Yeah. Now, see, I think that with the exception of your wife, most people, I think, and Michael Stipe, most people are going to be fans of the Beatles in one form or another, either fanatics like you and I, or maybe casual listeners who enjoy the music. And so I think that this has a potential for a large audience. I'm just not sure if people who, let's say, are unfamiliar with the film, who've never seen the animated film, would pick up this book. Although if it has the name The Beatles on it, then I think that's a big draw.
Does Bill Morrison have a draw? He's a huge name. He did Bongo Comics and he did all those Simpson things. He's the editor of Mad Magazine. I know that, if you didn't know it was him, maybe you wouldn't know it was him, but is he a big draw too? I'm just speaking out of ignorance. I'm not trying to.
I don't know. I would think that it would be the Beatles and or Yellow Submarine that would be the draw.
Okay, because he's a big time creator. He's influential and big in the fields.
Right,
so.
And I think it's important that they had someone like that do this adaptation. Because, I'm with you. This is a wonderful adaptation. I have no problem with it being completely faithful. Sometimes with adaptations, if it's too faithful to the original and leaves little room for variation, I feel a little uncomfortable, and I'm not very appreciative of that adaptation. This is a different game, right? Because if it had varied too far from the original Yellow Submarine, I'd be suspicious. And maybe because I'm a Beatles fan. Maybe that's it. But I'm glad that it is very faithful. And another big draw, and you mentioned this, is the color. God, vibrant color, like the film.
Right.
Yeah, I'm just really impressed. And another thing about Yellow Submarine that I appreciate is that it's laid out in what you could argue is largely a non-traditional panel form. They're panels, but they're not the kind of, let's say, square 9-grid layout that you have. In fact, in places, there's a question as to how to read a particular page or a 2-page spread.
Yeah.
Some of the pages may be easier to interpret than others, but then there's some of these 2-page spreads where you're not exactly sure where to go next, from one set of images to another. And many times it's because you don't have panels, you don't have any kind of, even pseudo panel. In other words, a kind of break between one set of images to the other. Mm-hmm. And I think that's fine because that adds to the chaos that I think is a big part of the story of Yellow Submarine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I love it too. I agree with you. I mean, a lot of the panels or the gutters are more, instead of straight lines, they're almost like windy little roads or vines or sometimes like lightning bolts. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know. It's like it's a much different reading experience. Like you said, it draws your eyes in different ways. It's got a different kind of energy and vibe to it. And another thing I really liked, which is like the movie, I guess, if you're a Beatles fan, I mean, this book is like, there are so many Beatles references or references to songs or, the green apples and the sea of green. And, they just mention a thing here and there and you read it and you're like, oh yeah, that's the Nowhere Man and all these things that it's very rewarding. Mm-hmm. 'Cause it's kind of like, oh yeah, I get the reference. I know this thing. I'm steeped in the music. And that's what I kind of expected. Like I was going to read it and be like, well, I don't hear the song here, so I don't like the book, but I do. I might not hear the music, like physically hear the music, but I know the music and I know what the song is, and it's kind of going in the back of my head as I'm reading things. Mm-hmm. Which that was the book is very evocative that way. It kind of captures that aspect of the movie that it's like a Mad magazine, which I guess is appropriate. There's so much, like the chicken fat, like in the Mad magazine, there's just so much stuff in the pages mm-hmm. with the colors and the images. And so you're just trying to get it all is, it's a very positive experience for me.
Yeah. I agree. Now we mentioned that, Morrison's adaptation of Yellow Submarine is very faithful to the plot of the film Yellow Submarine. Now, mm-hmm. for obvious reasons, the only thing that you don't have in the book that you have in the film are the musical interludes. Mm-hmm. And so, there are these stretches in Yellow Submarine where we get music like Nowhere Man or one of my favorites of the Beatles later, over, Hey Bulldog, mm-hmm. Or Only a Northern Song, or It's All Too Much, or what have you, or All You Need Is Love. So you don't get those musical scenes. And mm-hmm. those are part of the fun of the film experience of Yellow Submarine, mm-hmm. right? Where you're not just following the story, which is fun in and of itself, but you also get, what we had a little while ago referred to as, pseudo music videos, right? Mm-hmm. So we get the entire song, Hey Bulldog, and we get the animation that goes with it. So, I mean, and that's kind of fun as well. Now, obviously, we can't get that in a graphic novel, but one of the things that you mentioned is that one of the things that Bill Morrison does is he refers to some of the music in a way that's evocative. So for those of us who have seen the film, we can kind of fill in that gap with this pseudo music video if we want to remember it that way. And mm-hmm. for those who haven't seen the film, they're not out of anything, because I don't think that the way that Morrison refers to the music in this book is going to be any kind of limitation to those who aren't familiar with the animation.
Right. Yeah. I think it's an impressive feat to mm-hmm. make an adaptation of a movie that's as visually striking and, it's specific. Like, what Yellow Submarine looks like if you've ever seen Yellow Submarine. Yeah. And to kind of make a thing that kind of stands on its own is very impressive to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Plus, it's quite brave, because this is mm-hmm. rather iconic. Right. Well, the Beatles are iconic. So, you're taking them on.
Yeah, exactly. This is my hat's off to Bill Morrison for pulling this off, because I was like, oh, I'll read this quick. It'll be a quick flip, and I'll be like, all right, it's not as good as the movie. But it's really good.
Yeah. Another book that we highly recommend.
Oh, yes. How's that? It's really good. That's quotable, right?
Yeah, I'm sure that on any reprints, they'll say Comics Alternative. It's real good.
That's it. Real good. We'll say it that way. I really liked it. I know this is every book. I'm like, oh, I had really low expectations. And then I'm like, wow, that was really good.
Sturge, you want to move on to the third book that we're going to be looking at this week on our special Beatles episode?
Sure. Is that the Beatles in comics?
Yeah, this is the one that is coming out late. It may already be out in comic shops, but it comes out in wide release in bookshops on November 30th, and it's from NBM. And the writers of the book are Michel Mabel and Gaetz. And then there's a variety of artists, so I'm not even going to go through their names. But now, if I'm not mistaken, Michel Mabel does the prose pieces that I think that are interspersed, that are a part of each chapter, each section. And then Gaetz, and it's interesting, his name is, or his, it may not be a him, who knows? It's Gaet apostrophe S. So, and I double checked that, and yes, it's apostrophe S. Does the writing, I think, of the comic section. And then we have a variety of artists. Yeah,
it's an interesting collection of things. I will say that
it is, and this is another book in translation. This is, I guess, it originally came out in French from Edition Petit, and it is translated by Joe Johnson. This is titled Beatles in Comics. And I have to tell you from the outset, I'm a little ticked because I feel misled because at least half of this book is prose.
Right.
Which I have no problem with. But if you're going to title a book The Beatles in Comics, then at least the majority of the book should be comics about or concerning the Beatles. And that's not necessarily what we have.
Right.
In essence, the structure of the book is each chapter, and the chapters vary, right? So there's a chapter on Hamburg. There's one on Brian Epstein. There's one on George Martin. There's one when they met the Queen on the Ed Sullivan Show. The song Yesterday, Elvis meeting the Beatles, A Hard Day's Night. The death of Brian, Yoko Ono when they went to India, even the Paul is dead phenomena they covered a chapter, which I thought was really interesting. And of course the breakup of the Beatles, but and there are many other chapters as well, but in each of these chapters, basically what you have is a, somewhat short, sometimes longer than shorter essay on what that phenomena is. So for instance, we begin the Hamburg section with an essay on the Beatles in Hamburg.
Right.
And then we get a comic that concerns the Beatles in Hamburg. When we get to meeting the Queen, there's a short essay on playing for the Queen. And then we get a comic on playing for the Queen. And so that's the way that this is set up. And I have no problem with that setup. But again, if you're going to title a book, The Beatles in Comics, then I would expect more comics than otherwise.
Yeah. And I liked, I kind of asked myself that question too about this book. Like, okay, who's Yellow Submarine for? Who is the Beatles in comics for? And those text pieces kind of struck me. I liked them. I think I wasn't as taken aback by them. Maybe because I heard you talk about them before I read the book.
So I warned you.
That's all right. But I don't know. They were more like little historical pieces too, because they had, along with the texts, there's lots of little images and magazine covers and newspaper stories and things like that kind of show the reality. And then you kind of get the comic story that, I'm not going to say it totally retreads or revisits, but it's like a different take on the same phenomenon. So there's a lot of, like if you don't know a lot about the theme, it's like the text piece kind of introduces it, and then you can read the comic and kind of get it fleshed out in a much different way. And I kind of liked the experience of getting things twice. Even though a lot of these things were kind of fresh in my head from having read the Lennon book, because the Lennon book, covers kind of the history of the Beatles too, as does this. I mean, but they're very different because this is multiple viewpoints and a lot more artists involved with the the illustrations and the images. So you're getting a lot more variety in terms of what's being communicated and how things are being just depicted tonally and in colors and things. So it was really, I don't know, to me, this book, it had a lot of insight for me too. There were things that I didn't quite realize. I had heard about, the Beatles, Stones, the fake rivalry. I listened to an interview with Paul McCartney. He was on WTF not that long ago, and he talked about the whole, like I think the Beatles and Stones were basically like sounding boards for each other. They were much more helpful to each other. They'd be like, oh, you should try this. You should try this. Oh, we did this. So this artist was good. Like they were a lot more collaborative than rivals. So that wasn't really revelatory, but it was kind of interesting to see their take on it here. And the Paul is dead part, that definitely stood out to me too. That was one of the really kind of interesting things that, just how that thing evolved and how, basically it was like one DJ with some kind of crank thing.
Yeah.
How it just kind of blew up.
Mm-hmm.
And that in this and in the Lennon book too, also how the whole, what Lennon's were bigger than Jesus thing, and how that kind of took on a life of its own and was misappropriated or misunderstood or
taken out of context. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Just went totally off the rails.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something I appreciated in this book too, just because I think it kind of, it illuminated lots of different aspects of their careers, and the styles being various. There was times I loved it and there was times I kind of hated it.
You mean the art styles?
Yes. And it's not because of the artists themselves. It's just that some things I was like, something seemed a little bit more, I don't know. I really liked, like, for instance, the section on the Beatles and the Stones, the artist who did that, I will look at the beginning, and it was, where is it? Beatles and Stones.
What was that chapter?
I'm trying to remember. It's the one where they look like toads, because their eyes, to me, they look like toads just because their eyes are done in this really stylistic way. It's on page, where is it?
Well, as you're looking for that, I mean, I think it's worth pointing out that I'm with you that sometimes the art really resonated. At other times, it didn't resonate as much. I don't think that there was any art or any artists that I thought, oh God, this is just terrible. I'm going to put this book down and not pick it up for a while because I'm pissed off. I never had that experience, but I liken it to kind of an anthology, right? Because in any given anthology, there's no way that you can have, I guess there is a possible way. But chances are there's not going to be, the chance that every single entry in that anthology is going to blow you away. I mean, there are going to be some that have lesser of an impact than others. Same thing with a book like this, where you have a variety of different artists, right? There's some that are going to really hit you on a gut level that you're going to absolutely love. And then others that, maybe so-so, but you're going to have that. So I think that that's the nature of the beast, given a text of this sort.
Oh, sure. And the section I'm talking about, it's called The Hard Day's Night, and the art is by Victor Jimenez. And it's just, the book has, more cartoony styles, more realistic styles. And his is just, their eyes all look, they look toad-like to me, but in a pleasing way. Cause it's just, I don't know. It's like caricatures, and it really works. And, talking about their lives and, kind of about their movies, and kind of, I won't call them debacles, but the band was not very taken with the movie experiences in general, from what I've gathered from these books. And, even hearing, reading up on their lives, like what I do know about their biographies. But I really like the art there. I like that, it's different. It's a much different take. It's like a beautiful kind of ugly art to me.
Yeah, it is. I mean, look at Ringo's eyes. I mean, Paul's are really big. But Ringo's, I mean, he has these big bags under his eyes. And so there is something, I hadn't even thought of it, but there is something, I guess, somewhat frog-like about it. Now that you mention it. Yeah. I want to come back to a couple of things that you've said. The whole Stones Beatles rivalry that kind of made up, that's again, one of the things about this book that I appreciated was the fact that, they point this out, that this is not, it wasn't that big of a deal at the time, that the real rivalry was with the Beach Boys. But, it was, I think, a productive rivalry between the Beach Boys in the U.S. and then the Beatles in the U.K.
Sure.
Because basically what you had was, and Brian Wilson is on record saying that it was Rubber Soul that basically threw down the gauntlet for him, so to speak.
Right.
And he had to come up with something that was more impressive than that. And that's when we got Pet Sounds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were kind of like going back and forth.
And then Paul listened to Pet Sounds, was blown away by it, and he had to do something better than Pet Sounds. And that's where we got Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Of course, at the same time that Sgt. Pepper's going on, Brian Wilson was working on Smile. And unfortunately, Smile wasn't finished at the time.
Right.
And I think that could have been the Beach Boys' Sgt. Pepper's and rivaled Sgt. Pepper's in terms of impact. But that's another story. I don't want to go down the Beach Boys path. Maybe if there's a biography of the Beach Boys in comics later on, we can discuss that. I'd love to.
Oh, yeah.
I'm a gigantic Beach Boys and Brian Wilson fan. Another thing I want to mention that you commented on, I'm glad you made the connection between Beatles in comics and Lennon the New York years, because both of them in many ways are, for all practical purposes, a chronological overview of the Beatles. And I think this comes back to a question that you were asking, not only with Beatles in comics, but also especially Yellow Submarine. Who is this for? I would think that this book by NBM, The Beatles in Comics, would be for those who may want to learn about the Beatles, who aren't familiar with the Beatles or the Beatles' history. And in ways that Yellow Submarine isn't, right? Because I mean, you could appreciate Yellow Submarine without knowing much about either the Beatles or the film Yellow Submarine. But I think you get more out of it if you know about the film and you know about the Beatles. You know, because you mentioned all the Beatles song references in Yellow Submarine, and you're right. That's a big part of not only the animation, but also Morrison's book. But I think Beatles in comics, you could know absolutely nothing about the Beatles.
Oh, sure.
And then pick up the Beatles in comics and come away, much more informed about what's going on. And I think because the way that things are set up chronologically, I think it does provide or can provide a good overview, an introduction to the Beatles, who they were, their career, their various albums, different experiences that they had. And sometimes going into detail. So for instance, we get, again, quite a bit of information about when the Beatles met the Queen, which you don't get in a lot of, let's say, Beatle overviews. Their experience at Shea Stadium and touring, which we were mentioning earlier. They're meeting Elvis, which doesn't get that much coverage in terms of, let's say, Beatles overview. I mean, to me, if you're talking, when you're talking about Beatles overviews or histories, there's much more attention given to the Beatles meeting Bob Dylan than the Beatles meeting Elvis. But in this book, even though the Dylan reference is made, much more attention is given to the Beatles meeting Elvis.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that kind of struck me in both books, because they depicted them meeting Elvis in both things. And in the Lennon book, it was much more like, I don't think it was very positive in this book. They kind of hung out and they jam a little bit. And then Elvis is kind of like, well, too bad, we can't do this. And they're like, well, go see us. And he's like, well, I'm busy. And they just leave. And in the Lennon book, it's more like a lot is made that Elvis sent the letter to the Sullivan Show to be read on the Sullivan Show when the Beatles came on for that debut that everyone talks about being like that, landmark moment.
Right.
And, in the Lennon book, he talks more like about how that letter wasn't so much a welcome as it was a, hey, remember me? I'm the big dog here in this pond. So don't forget that. And then when they met him, he was kind of very standoffish and didn't really want to talk with them or be friendly or anything. He was just kind of doing it because it was kind of like, here I am. And they were really just taken with the fact that he had remote controls that worked without wires than anything else. And they were like, oh, look, I have all these TVs and you can just push a button and it changes the channel. And that was the thing. And then they just kind of leave. I mean, to me, that's one of the strengths of this book that you talked about. It's got a whole lot of unique moments, and it's like the
Beatles in comics.
Yes, and the Beatles in comics, just because it's got broad moments. It's got small things. It focuses on specific songs and specific meetings. And if you didn't know, it's got a lot of context for you. So it's got those news stories. It's got the little informational, paragraphs and things like that, the prose. And, it really sets it up for you. And yeah, the Elvis one kind of struck me because in the Beatles and comics, it seems, it's not like it's friendlier than in the Lennon one. It seems like it was very cold and very awkward.
Right.
And in this one, at least, it seems like they had a good time. Like they all danced and wiggled around and jammed on guitars, at least. Mm-hmm. Which that was, that's something. But because, Elvis is kind of like the dinosaur at that point. It's like, oh, these are the hip new people. And, it's kind of like the passing of the guard, not passing of the guard, changing of the guard.
Right.
Passing of the baton.
Yeah. And, in the Lennon book, it does make sense that the whole experience with Elvis is a little more sour because, Lennon, is a big personality, right? And so with his own ego.
Right.
Speaking of egos, another thing that comes out in, I think, both the Lennon book, especially the Lennon book, but also the Beatles and comics, is the fact that Paul McCartney is much more of a manipulator than most people are led to believe. And that makes perfect sense to me. This is a guy who is the perennial showman. I say most people who are Beatles fans tend to gravitate toward John over Paul. I happen to be one of those who gravitate toward Paul over John, as much as I love John Lennon. I don't know, maybe because when I was younger, Paul McCartney, a lot of his solo stuff I really enjoyed, even the bad stuff like My Love that I enjoyed and I still enjoy. Come on. Whoa, 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 whoa. Hey. Whoa, 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 whoa. And, even those sappy, silly love songs that he does are catchy and they're earworms, right? They get right into your head and you can't get them out, even, no matter how hard you try to get them out. But Paul does come across in these books as a little less, light, let's say, and a little more manipulative. And we definitely get this in the Lennon book, because Lennon says at one point to his therapist that he was a manipulator, especially at the very end, because Paul or John had announced that he wanted to leave the Beatles, but they decided to put that off for a while, the announcement, because they were, working on an album and other things. But then later on, not too long after that, Paul announces to the press without telling the other lads that he's leaving the Beatles.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And, in Lennon, in the New York Years book, points out that, this is Paul being very manipulative, and it probably was,
Yeah, and that's something that struck me too, because that was something I wanted to. I had it in my head at one point to talk about, but in the Lennon book, that was one of the things that struck me is that at some point I think he says I created the Beatles or I formed the Beatles, and then he says at some point I broke up the Beatles. But he also talked about, it was a thing I hadn't really thought of, is that the Beatles basically existed for a decade, and for the first 5 years he was like they were my band. And then after Sgt. Pepper's, they turned into Paul's band. Right.
And in the Lennon book, and I know we're discussing the Beatles and comics, but in the Lennon book, he does mention the point where it became Paul's band. Mm-hmm. And, he had felt like he wanted to kind of withdraw from a while or from the Beatles for a while because he was getting kind of tired and he felt worn down. And it was around 1967. And this is, soon after they decided to quit touring,
right,
in 1966. And then Paul comes in with this idea for Sgt. Pepper's, and Lennon points out in the book, Lennon, the New York Years, it's at this point that the band became Paul's. And for all practical purposes, that's probably the case, from everything that I've read, from everything that I've heard. And we get a little of that, I think, in the Beatles and comics coming back to that book.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
No, and that's one of the things that what I think that this book does well too is kind of capture that complexity, because Paul, like you say, I agree, is kind of that manipulator with that whole thing after the Beatles. I mean, the Beatles technically hadn't broken up. They were still making that Let It Be record. John was like, I'm done. They cut another song without him. which, technically he's not in the band anymore. And then Paul decides, okay, I'm going to announce this. And by the way, there's this band Wings that I have a new record coming out with, just so that the Beatles are gone and Wings is coming, which is, showmanship, right?
Well, Wings doesn't come until later on. I mean, he has the solo album, McCartney,
that's right,
which is just him. And I think the first Wings album was Wildlife, and that didn't come out until... I can't recall when that came out, but even Ram was just Paul and Linda McCartney.
That's right. You're right. I'm sorry. I mixed up, but he did have a record though. He was like, I'm out of the Beatles and there's a record coming.
Right.
And, contrasting that with that, the one of the standout sections in this Beatles and comics book for me is the chapter on Yesterday, being that it is, it's the most covered song, I think
ever.
And Paul wrote it, and it's like not even disputed. It's like he wrote the whole thing. He did the whole thing. He performed all the things except for the little piano bit or the orchestral bits that he agreed to add in there. And it still says Lennon McCartney because that was their arrangement. And it's like something that's eating at him. I mean, the way it's done in this, they don't say that, but he's got those pupilless eyeballs that alternate being white and black. In that style, he's almost like a Keen. He looks almost like a Keen baby guy at some point.
Well, actually, the thing that bugs him about Yesterday is that it is Lennon McCartney, not McCartney Lennon, and he wanted to change that. As this chapter Yesterday points out, it's just that Yoko, as overseer of the Lennon estate, refused, which she can do. So that's what's eating him. That his name is not first on Yesterday as a writer.
But they have home runs. I mean, this is like all the home runs that they hit. But this is like the biggest home run that they ever hit. And it's like his home run, but he can't, his name is, and I get it. I mean, like throughout all the books, kind of just, Yoko is this, I mean, as a young person, there's, this tendency to be like Yoko. She, like you don't like Yoko. She's like the villain who came and like destroyed this thing that you love. And, it's not quite as simple as that. And it's easy to cast her as the villain. And I get why. I mean, if she says, okay, that one, you get to switch the credits. And then what does Paul do and go, okay, well, I wrote this one too, and this one too, and this one too. And then, I mean, she's got the control over it, like that's, I get why she wouldn't.
Or she's got veto power. Right.
Yeah, she's got veto power. And I get why she's exercising it. I'm not saying it's right, but I understand.
Right. Yeah. And, in both of these books that are kind of historical overviews, Lennon, the New York Years, and especially the Beatles and comics, we do get this sense of Yoko as a quite complex character. You're right. Some people may the popular view is that she's the villain. She's the one that broke up the Beatles, but at the same time, she's someone that John needed at the time. And so she was a presence that didn't resonate with the others, because one of the things that you get, I think, to some degree in Lennon, the New York Years, but you definitely get in the Beatles and comics, is the fact that, George, Paul, Ringo, as well as George Martin didn't like her in the studio because she was a distraction. But this is someone that John wanted in the studio, and he felt that he needed her in her support. We get the sense that, Yoko is a much more complex figure within the environment of the Beatles. And that's one of the things I appreciated about the Beatles in comics, is that it does show that, she wasn't the villain. It doesn't take, this kind of traditional stereotypical view of her as the person who broke up the Beatles. So, I enjoyed that.
Yeah, and I did too. I mean, things are complex, and there's lots of places where you can get into the nuances of who did what and who's, doing dirty to who. And I thought it, just as a general overview, this Beatles and comics book was actually quite excellent, because it's like soup to nuts. Got their whole career. It's got lots of different ways of getting at things. And I'm a sucker for, at the end, there's all these like little movie tickets with little trivia on them, and little bits, and I like that. And it kind of has like that kind of afterword where it shows kind of what they do as where are they now? Ringo lives in Morocco. Yeah.
Well, honestly, I wish there had been a little more about the post Beatles work. But again, you can't have everything, right? There's only so much space. Now, I'm with you that I did enjoy the Beatles in comics. That being said, one of the things that irritated the hell out of me is the fact that this book was apparently not well edited. I don't know if you noticed, but there are a number of, if not typos, then mistitled songs. There's some of those. There's some factual errors. And also there's at least one or two places I recall, I didn't mark this down, where we see Paul with a right-handed guitar.
Oh.
Huh?
Travesty.
Anyone who knows the Beatles knows that Paul is left-handed, and so his guitar or bass is going to be left-handed, but there were a couple of illustrations I noticed where it was right-handed. It's like, come on, it's not as if he was right-handed and then became left-handed later on. So there are little mistakes like that, and I think that this book would be much more pleasing or much more successful, for me at least, if it had been more carefully edited.
Sure. And I get that. It's got its what's that? Imperfections. We'll call them that. It's got some flaws, but I think overall it's a good, if you're a Beatles fan, I think it's got enough to keep you interested and, novel enough for you to kind of latch onto. And if you aren't a Beatles fan, I think it's a very good introduction overall.
I agree.
I liked it.
Sturge, let's move on to the last book that we're going to be looking at. And we're probably not going to be talking about it as much as we've talked about Lennon, the New York Years, Yellow Submarine, or the Beatles in comics, because it's not about the Beatles per se, but it uses the Beatles as a backdrop, at least to one of the main storylines. And this is M. Dean's I Am Young, and this is came out from Fantagraphics earlier this month. It was probably in comic shops earlier. But according to Amazon, the wide release was November 20th. And, for the listeners of the podcast, you may recall that at SPX this year, I had the pleasure of actually sitting down with M. Dean and interviewing her about I Am Young and, some of her other work as well. And, I don't know, how would you describe I Am Young?
It's a collection of stories. And they are centered on music. It's not all Beatles music, although I'd say that there are. I think I went through and counted because I poured over this book a few times just to kind of make sense of things because I wanted all the stories to be linked, and they're not all linked. There's three that are more thematic than they are because there's one narrative that's interspersed throughout that's the long narrative, I would say, which is the Beatle connection, because it's about a young couple,
George and Miriam.
Yep, that's right, George and Miriam, who meet at a Beatles concert and they fall in love, and it's kind of like for lack of a better description, it's kind of like a When Harry Met Sally situation, in that it shows their relationship over a long period of time, although it's not really a rom-com kind of book. It's more like a serious look at people who kind of fall in and out of each other's lives at various points. And, at the beginning of the book, I mean, it's the 60s and they're teenagers. And by the end of the book, it's more modern day, and they are older people who are kind of, living with their decisions, and, some positive, some not so positive. And they kind of have this eternal bond, though, because of where they were at that moment. And they kind of like the touchstone moments are kind of like every time a Beatle dies, they kind of have to check in with each other and see where they are. So when John dies, it's a big moment, and it kind of like rekindles their connection for a time being. And then, a bunch of years go by, and then when George dies, they kind of go back and do the same thing, except for they're in very different places in their lives.
Right.
And it's it's I would say it's a very nuanced, it's a very emotional book. It's got lots of different, this is a very complex kind of relationship that they have. It's beautiful. It's heartbreaking. It's a lot of things. This book, I did not expect it to be what it was, because I mean, we agreed. We're like, we're going to read some Beatles things. And I was like, this is not like the Beatles are the kind of the setup for it.
Yeah. They're the backdrop for the Miriam and George story. Right.
Mm-hmm. And it's gorgeous. It's like, it's got devastating. It's got a lot of things to it. This is a great book, I thought.
It is. Yeah. M. Dean really knocked it out of the park, I think, with I Am Young. And you're right. This is a series of stories that aren't interconnected, right? So this is not a story cycle. And we get, with the exception of George and Miriam, I think each of the stories that, are based on, I think, music in one form or another, but they're about relationships, right? And not necessarily between boy and girl, but it could be between two friends.
Right. Or parent and sibling, or not parent sibling, parent daughter. Or
parent daughter, yeah. And so, and it's not just the Beatles music that is used as kind of a keystone or kind of a backdrop of the narrative. We get the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds. We get Tom Jones. We get Chuck Berry. We even get a reference to ELO.
And Cab Calloway. Yeah. So, I mean, howdy ho.
Yeah. Each of these stories are based on, in some way or another, or at least reference music, either a particular album or a particular musical act in general. But with the exception of the George and Miriam story, each of these narratives that deal with music and relationships in one form or another are one shots, right? So we'll see them just for that chapter, and that's it. But I think the main storyline or the main narrative in this collection is the George and Miriam story, which is why we're including this in our Beatles special episode, because the Beatles do become not only the backdrop of the relationship, but also, as you pointed out, a nexus point, right? Yeah. So when something happens with the Beatles, whether it be a concert or whether it be the death of John, it causes them to get together. It causes them to find some kind of common ground and to kind of assess their relationship, where they are in their lives at that time. So we get at the very beginning, not the very first chapter, but I think the second, is when both George and Miriam meet each other at a Beatles concert. This is early in the Beatles' career. And we even see on the page, this is page 12, and the chapter is titled Greyfriars Bobby. The albums that we see of the Beatles are their early ones, right? We see Please Please Me. We see Beatles for Sale. We see Meet the Beatles and then A Hard Day's Night. And then later on, as their relationship develops, each of these chapters are prefaced by other images of Beatle albums, but they're later Beatle albums. So we have early career, middle career, later career, and then the end, so to speak. And so again, even though this is not a book about the Beatles or a storyline about the Beatles are a major part of it. And I think that that's really interesting how M. Dean uses the Beatles as a point of, I guess, of exploration. About many of the things that you described, right? How these people get together, how they grow apart, how they come back together, how they begin taking different directions in their lives. And she uses the Beatles as a jumping off point.
Yeah. And it's almost like the Beatles are, I don't know, it's like their career or their albums are almost like a reflection of, I don't know, just an overall spirit of the thing. Like they're young people. So it's like the early Beatles, the more poppy, catchy romance, not complicated. And then things get complicated and then things change and they transform and then, they drop away and then they're isolated and then they're by themselves. And then you kind of get like the ones at the end, like the Paul McCartney Flaming Pie and the George Harrison, Cloud Nine, like, not the ones that people usually think of first or second or even fifth when they think of these artists, but that's kind of the things that kind of reflect their lives, how they get complex and how they change and morph and become very different things. It's like, I I was thinking it was almost like touchstones or something like that. I liked you're calling them nexus points or nexus, the Beatles being the nexus, because it's almost like their career and evolution is kind of reflective of, how these two people live their lives and kind of fall in and out of each other's lives over decades, and how they transform and become things that are unrecognizable, maybe at the beginning.
Yeah. Another thing that I was really impressed about in terms of what M. Dean does in I Am Young, we definitely get this in the George and Miriam storyline. We get this occasionally in some of the other stories, but definitely with the George and Miriam storyline that we're, primarily discussing here. And that is the different ways of reading these sections.
Yeah.
More times than not, what you have is two strips. You have, let's say, the Miriam strip toward the top of the page, and then you have the George strip toward the bottom. And then along with the visuals, the comic proper, you have a letter, or at least a part of a letter, that each is writing the other. So, for instance, right now I'm on page 46. And I think this is the second chapter where we have George and Miriam. And so you can read. And in fact, I had to go back and kind of recalibrate the way that I was reading this book when I read it for the first time back in September. And that was, instead of trying to read an entire page all at once, what I would do, especially with these George and Miriam sections, is I would go through a particular chapter and just read, let's say, the Miriam comic. And then I would go back through the chapter reading just the George comic. Then I would go back through and read the letter that Miriam writes to George. And then I would go through a fourth time and read the letter section. Again, that's either right above or right below the comic that George writes to Miriam. Now, you could try to take that on all in one sitting, right? So read just one page in its entirety and then move on. I mean, it's possible, and I could do that. I prefer, though, to read the different sections. And so this is a book that I think even challenges or questions the way that we read, the way that we consume not just comics, but a narrative.
Yeah. And for me, what it was is what I had to go back and look at, too, aside from the letters and trying to figure out, okay, who's saying what, and realizing that the top text is not a continuation, or the bottom text is not a continuation of the top text on each page. That's parallel narrative or parallel letters on top of kind of parallel narratives sometimes. Was kind of trying to reconcile the stories too, because especially the baby fat one, I was like, is this Miriam? Like, did she dye her hair and have like kinds of like this weird exploratory thing? Because there was that. And then I wanted to tie it to the original story, which is about a widower and his daughter, and talking about her mom. And she's got this mysterious first marriage. And then after I read the book, I had to go back and be like, did Miriam die? Like at the very beginning, was that her story? Like, because just thematically, I think that they're just so tonally similar, that the stories, you could read all of this organically through and try to, like, that's how I kind of wanted to do it, to power through the whole thing and be like, okay, this is all one narrative, but it's not. And it resists that. And I think it's, like it's about tone, I guess, in a lot of ways. And those stories fit together. I think it's not really, like you said, it's an anthology or a collection, but it's more like a tonal anthology than it is it's not all set in the same place or anything like that.
That's a good way of putting it, a tonal anthology. And you're right. I mean, these stories are not connected. They're not all Miriam in different parts of times of her life. But they do set a tone, right? I mean, they all deal with music as a backdrop in one form or another, different kind of musicians, musical acts. But they deal with relationships as well. Yeah. And so I think that's where the tonal, quality comes out and connects it. But, even if we just limit ourselves to the George and Miriam story that concerns the Beatles, there are times that, as I mentioned, like for instance, on page 46, where what we have going on in the Miriam comic strip is disconnected from what's going on with the George comic strip, which says something about their relationship, right? You know, these are people who are disconnected in many ways. But then if you turn the page, look on page 47, you have the Miriam strip on top and you have the George strip at the bottom. They're in dialogue. So when she answers the phone in that first panel, hello, don't go over to the next panel of her strip, go down, and George says, hello, Miriam, how are you? And then you go up to that second panel of the Miriam strip. Hi, George, I'm fine. I'm so happy to just hear your voice. And then you go down to George. Listen, I'm going to move to Edinburgh and I think we should live together. And then you go up to the third panel where she pauses. And then you go down to the third George panel where he is waiting for a response. And then that final panel of the Miriam strip, yes, I think we should. And then we go down to the final panel of the George strip. Yeah, we should. I love you. So, you know, even though there are occasions where the Miriam and the George strips are disconnected almost completely at times, there are other occasions where they connect and are in dialogue one with the other. And that says something about their relationship, because there are times in their relationship that they are together, and then there are other times where they're just completely separate and have lost track of each other and on different planets almost.
Yeah, and that's one of the things about the book I really like too, is that it did just visually all of the ways that she sets up pages to kind of contrast their experiences. Because there's lots of, like you said, complex reading experiences where you want to go top to bottom, or you can see left to right. And the way that the pages have been set up, they're definitely parallel experiences. And I mean, it strikes me that I guess it's very apt that she picked the Beatles, in that, you know, we've talked about, you know, the strong personalities of John and Paul, basically, and them being in different places. I mean, having read all the things that we read, you know, they were definitely on different life trajectories, and, you know, their voices come out stronger or weaker depending on, you know, the time periods, or in conjunction even. And, you know, George and Miriam's relationship is very similar in that sense, in that they're, you know, sometimes they seem to be on the same page and collaborating, and other times they're doing their own things, and they're doing, you know, they're moving in many different directions, or at least two divergent directions sometimes. And, you know, it's kind of like this beautiful love story, but not like a trite love story that's going to wrap up nicely. It's like, you know, they have a very complex kind of relationship, and the love that they share is complicated, and doesn't come to the points that we usually see in a, you know, the typical romance, or at least the popular sort of romance that we, you know, come to expect and consume.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that we were mentioning earlier is how with the George and Miriam sections, what Emdine does is she begins these sections with kind of a collage of, at first, Beatles albums, and then Beatles solo albums. I want to make a comment about on page 82, and this is, I think, the penultimate George and Miriam section, where they actually get together because of John's death.
Right.
I believe. And I find it interesting, the albums that Emdine chose to illustrate, because we have on page 82, we have John Lennon's Imagine. That makes sense to me. Ringo's Rotogravure. Okay, I guess. I think that there are other Ringo albums that would have been a little more representative. The George Harrison is his George Harrison album from, I think, 1979, 78. It's the one that has Blow Away on it.
Right.
And, you know, I mean, I love the song Blow Away, and the album's okay. I could just think of other George Harrison albums that would probably be as appropriate, let's say, as Imagine with John Lennon. But then the Paul McCartney, this is the one that I think is the most contemporary, because it came out in 1980, and it's McCartney 2. And okay, you know, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a big Paul McCartney fan. And so a lot of people do not like McCartney 2. I'll put up with McCartney 2. I'll even listen to Temporary Secretary and not wince. Okay. And I do love the song Coming Up. You know, I like the studio version, especially. Right. But why McCartney 2? Why not something like Band on the Run? You know, or even Venus and Mars, you know, which is not his strongest album, but still, I don't know. It just struck me. It's curious, the choices that she makes. Now, in the very last section, it's interesting in that the albums that she shows, I mean, Double Fantasy, okay, that makes sense.
Right.
George Harrison's Cloud 9, that makes sense to me. I'm not familiar with Ringo Starr Old Wave.
I don't know that one at all.
Yeah. And then Flaming Pie, again, that makes sense to me. Mm-hmm. Because that was supposed to be kind of a, serious comeback album for Paul. Whether it was or not, I don't know, but I thought it was good.
I remember being advertised heavily. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I love Cloud 9. I like George.
Yeah.
To me, I wanted the Double Fantasy to be before, because that was more of that was about the time that he died. Mm-hmm. I still buy Imagine, but I agree with you. I like, I don't know, some of the record choices. I don't know, maybe they're deep cuts. Maybe it's like a metaphor, and it's something else.
Yeah, and maybe M. Dean's a fan of Temporary Secretary as well.
That's right. Well, maybe Miriam is and George isn't, and that's why they don't. Some part of their chemistry that doesn't work. Who knows? Yeah. But I agree with you, actually, about this is an aside from the comics, but as a kid and as an adolescent and as a college student, it's hard to deal with, or not, the sensitive poet that I am or was. I don't know. John, was like, oh, I'm going to build an altar to John, and all the things. But yeah, lately I gravitate a lot. Like I will listen to Paul all the time. Like if I had to pick a Beatle to listen to, like even if it got worse and the draconian people said you can't even listen to just one artist, you have to pick one member of the band, I would pick Paul to listen to, like Paul's discography over all the other discographies. I know George is the most talented, and George has a soft spot in my heart because I do love Traveling Wilburys. I'm going to say that.
Oh yeah,
whether it gets things thrown at me or not. And he also,
why would people throw things at you? They're phenomenal.
I don't know. I think that they're awesome, but I don't know. There's people that I've heard, and maybe they're fictional people that I'm making up, but I always had this perception that Traveling Wilburys, everyone thought it was like some kind of like classic rock cash grab or something, which I never thought of it as.
No, it's basically Tom Petty, Bob Dylan, Roy Orbison, George Harrison, and Jeff Lynne just getting together to have fun. That's right.
And that's what I thought too. And they never toured or did anything. They just kind of existed, and it made me appreciate a whole lot of them again. Like you think of them as kind of scenery in some sense, and you kind of get them doing something new, and you're like, oh, okay. But George did Basketball Jones, the Cheech and Chong song, which I had no idea. I did a little research, and plus he did, what was it? Handmade Films. I guess he made Monty Python movie. I think Life of Brian came through that.
Yeah.
Time Bandits.
Yeah.
So George did, and I love My Sweet Lord. But anyway, whether he got sued or not, whether he plagiarized unconsciously or not.
Yeah. And by the way, George Harrison's theme song for Time Bandits is incredible.
Oh yeah, that's entirely true. George is, I think, highly underrated.
Yes.
As a Ringo, I kind of get the sense of, like I'd want to hang out with Ringo. Ringo's probably the most fun person in the world, from everything I've seen. Like if I had to hang out with a Beatle, I would hang out with Ringo. And I have a soft spot for Caveman because there was a summer I was in Greece, and it was one of the few American VHSs we had access to. So I saw Caveman a lot of times.
Wow.
I know.
I think I've seen it just once.
It's all you need.
Well, Serge, we've covered a lot of ground on today's episode, which I guess I've called it a special before. I guess in many ways it is a special, right? Because we're focusing on Beatles-related comics that have come out, let's say, over the past year and a half. There are some exceptions, right? We didn't look at, again, Fab Four Mania by Carol Tyler just because we interviewed her earlier this year. But that's a book that I think that people should definitely check out as well.
That's right.
But we
love Carol.
That's right. But we started off with a discussion of Lennon, the New York Years. This is written by David Foenkinos and adapted by Corbeyran. I guess that's how you pronounce the name, and Horne. Corbeyran was the writer and Horne was the illustrator. After that, we looked at Bill Morrison's Yellow Submarine adaptation, a colorful book, if nothing else.
Oh, yeah.
Then we looked at, a collection of different prose and comics pieces, the Beatles and comics, with the prose pieces written by Michel Mabel and the writer of the comics, I guess, Gaetz, and a variety of different artists. And then we concluded with a discussion of M. Dean's I Am Young, especially the George and Miriam storyline, which has everything to do with the Beatles.
Oh, yeah. I really love that book. I suggest you read all of them, but that one, to me, was like exceptionally awesome.
Yes. And if you want to find great discounts on the kind of books that we've been discussing this week, then you would do well to check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, and there you will find a whole slew of discounts that will not disappoint. That's dcbservice.com.
That's right. I Am Young, by the way, is available for 35% off. So go find that book there. And if you do get your comics at DCB Service, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can contact us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. Or you can email us the new old-fashioned way at twoguysacomics.alternative.com. Or just email me at sturge@comicsalternative.com.
Or me at derek@comicsalternative.com. And you can contact us via social media. We're all over the place. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcast. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Google Podcasts, on iHeartRadio, and on TuneIn. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
That sounds great, Derek.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I was going to do a number 9 at the end to lead us out, but I don't think that's good.
Well, yeah. Yeah, especially if it's the, what is it?
Backward mask.
Yeah, we can backward mask this podcast episode. We'll be back next week, and next week should be our December preview show, so check back for that. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Sturge. We'll see ya.
Keep rocking.
Yeah.
Hey, what happened?